Good Saturday morning, March 11th, 2023. Old school versus new school baseball analysis. Who's better? 150 years of baseball, two 75-year periods, 1870s through 1949, roughly 75 years. 1950 through 2022, another 75 years. The first 75, old school. Second 75, new school. This video, based on balls, I compare the eras. Who wins? 1870s, the average for the decade, for a 10-year period, 10 base on balls. The leader for that decade was Jim O'Rourke, had 20 walks one season. Very low, right? 1880s, the average was 52 walks. Who had the high? Roger Connor, 93. Excuse me. 1890s, 10-year period, the average 104 walks, base on balls. Who had the most? Billy Hamilton, 128. 1900s, the average 78, went down from 104 in the 1890s, 78, 1900s. Who had the high in walks? Billy Hamilton again, 107. 1910s, average walks 92. Who had the most walks? Eddie Collins, 119. 1920s, it goes way up. I don't know what happened during that decade. Some guy named Babe Ruth came along, right? The average base on balls for an individual to lead the league, 132. And who had the most in that decade? Babe Ruth, 170 walks. 1930s, average base on balls, 123. Who had the most walks? Babe Ruth, 136. 1940s, the average base on balls, 126. And who received the most walks? Ted Williams, 162. To the aggregate base on balls for the first 75 years for old school baseball players, 89 walks. Let's look at new school. 1950s, average 121. Who had the most? Mickey Mantle, 146. 1960s, average 118. Who had the most walks? Harmon Killebrew, 145. 1970s, average 117 walks. Who had the most? Willie McCovey, 137. 1980s, 110 is the average base on balls. Who had the most walks for the decade? Mike Schmidt, 128. 1990s, average 125 walks. Who had the most? Jeff Bagwell, 149. 2000s, the average 107. And the leader in receiving walks, Jim Thome, 122. And 2010s, the average goes down to 74. 74. And who had the most walks in that decade? I only deal with Hall of Fame players in all this analysis. 82 for David Ortiz. So the aggregate base on balls for the second 75-year period, new school baseball players, 110. What did I say the old school was at? 89. So new school wins. So right now, I'm covering 13 offensive categories. Batting average, old school. Most hits, old school. Runs scored, old school. Got a chart here. Runs batted in, new school. Home runs, new school. Triples, old school. Doubles, old school. Singles, old school. Slugging, new school. On base, old school. Total bases, new school. Walks, new school. The score is 7-5, old school. And I got one more offensive category, stolen bases. We'll get into that video next, and that'll be 13 categories. And who outperformed the other eras? Which era was better in these offensive categories? Old school baseball players or new school baseball players? Right now, it's 7-5, old school. I'll cover stolen bases in our next video. Then after that, I got something interesting. I'm going to get into pitching and compare the pitchers in the old school versus the new school. Who will win there? And then after that, I will get into defense. Who did better on defense during the period? We'll add it all up at the end, and this book reveals who was better at baseball. The old school ball players from the 1870s to the 1949, where I cut it off, or new school baseball players who began the 1950s to the present time. Who do you think wins? We'll have 13 offensive categories. Then I'll get into 7 pitching categories. And then I'll get into 8 defensive categories. We'll add it all up. Right now, the score is old school 7, new school 5. But when we get done with adding everything up, we'll figure out who's the best. Thanks for watching here. Next video, stolen bases. I'm out.